Lenora Whitcomb didn't knock. She never knocked. She walked into the Redfern dining room on a Tuesday morning like she owned every floorboard, every chair, and every breath of air inside the place. Her silk dress pressed sharp enough to cut glass. Her chin lifted so high she had to look down at Clara through the very bottom of her eyes. Clara was standing at the stove. Lenora picked up a biscuit from the basket on the table, turned it over in her gloved fingers, the way a person examined something they found stuck to the bottom of a boot, and then set it back down without tasting it. "Honey," she said, not warmly, not even politely, "do you actually believe these men are eating this food out of appreciation? Or are you too simple to understand that hungry men will eat sawdust if someone puts it in front of them?" Clara did not move. She kept her hand steady on the spoon, kept her eyes on the pot, and did not give Lenora Whitcomb the satisfaction of watching her flinch. But her jaw tightened, and the knuckle holding that spoon went white as bone. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who decided your worth before you walked in the room, if you've ever swallowed something burning because you knew the moment wasn't yours yet, then you already know exactly what Clara Bellamy was feeling in that kitchen. And you already know she wasn't going to stay quiet forever. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of story that makes you feel something real, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. We put out stories just like this one every single week, and we'd hate for you to miss what comes next. Drop a like on this video and leave a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning, because you need to understand exactly who Clara Bellamy was before she ever set foot in Hollow Creek. The train was late by 3 hours, which gave Clara Bellamy plenty of time to sit with her battered trunk on the platform and count the reasons this was a terrible idea. She had counted 47 by the time the locomotive finally wheezed into the station at Hollow Creek. She wasn't being dramatic. She was being honest with herself, which was something she had learned to do in the years since her father's business collapsed, and the life she had expected simply stopped being available to her. She had learned not to dress things up. A situation was what it was, and pretending otherwise only burned energy you didn't have to spare. So, 47 reasons this was a terrible idea, and she was getting off the train anyway. She was 28 years old. She had $31 tucked inside her left boot, a recipe box wrapped in a wool scarf at the bottom of her trunk, and a letter she had read so many times the folds were starting to tear. The letter was from a man named Silas Redfern, and it was 4 sentences long. It told her he had a working ranch, a spare room, and a need for someone to manage the household. It told her the arrangement was practical in nature. It told her the reverend in town could make things official within the week if she still intended to come. It did not say he was glad she was coming. It did not say he was looking forward to meeting her. It did not say much of anything except that there was a job to be done and he supposed she could do it. Clara had read it 47 times, and she still couldn't decide if that was refreshingly honest or the loneliest thing she had ever seen written in ink. She picked up her trunk and stepped off the train. Silas Redfern was easy enough to find. I was the only man on the platform not moving, just standing there with his arms at his sides and his hat pulled low, watching her come down the steps with an expression that told her absolutely nothing. He was taller than she'd imagined, broader through the shoulders. He had the kind of face that had been weathered into something permanent, a face that looked like it had decided years ago to stop reacting to things it couldn't control. He was not unkind. That was the first thing she noticed. He was also not warm. That was the second. "Miss Bellamy," he said. "Mr. Redfern," she said. He reached for the trunk. She let him take it. They walked to the wagon without another word, and for the first 10 minutes of the ride out to the ranch, neither of them spoke, and Clara sat straight on the wagon seat and watched the landscape roll past, and told herself that silence was not the same as hostility. She had learned that from her father, back when he still had a business and a reputation and a future. He'd been a quiet man, too. It hadn't meant anything sinister, but then again, her father had never looked at her the way Silas Redfern did when he finally did speak, like he was measuring the distance between what he'd agreed to and what had actually shown up. "You're younger than I expected," he said. "You're older," she said, because it was true, and she wasn't going to start this marriage by pretending otherwise. He blinked. Then he looked back at the road. Fair enough. That was the whole conversation. She learned more from the ranch hands than she did from Silas in those first minutes of arrival. There were 12 of them, and they came out of the barn and the bunkhouse and from around the side of the property the way men do when something new and out of place shows up. Not rushing, not welcoming, just drifting toward curiosity with their thumbs in their belt loops and their eyes doing the math. Clara stood in the yard and let them look. She had soft hands. She knew it. She knew they saw it. She hadn't spent the last 4 years hauling hay or mending fences. She'd spent them keeping a household together on almost nothing, cooking 3 meals a day from whatever she could stretch, nursing her younger sister through 2 different fevers, managing the slow disaster of a family coming apart at the seams. That was her kind of hard work. It didn't leave calluses in the places they were looking. The one named Amos, she found out later he was the foreman, 22 years on Redfern land, looked at her hands and then looked at Silas with an expression that said plainly, "You brought us a China doll." Silas didn't respond. Clara filed the expression away and followed him inside. The kitchen was worse than she expected, and she had expected bad. The stove had a warped burner that someone had jammed back into place with a folded piece of tin. The pantry shelves were uneven, and half of what was stored there had been pushed to the back and forgotten long enough to become questionable. There was a layer of grease along the back wall above the stove that spoke of months of neglect, and the long wooden table in the dining room had been used as a workbench at some point. She could see the tool marks scored into the surface, and no one had seen fit to clean it back to something you could eat off of. Silas showed her the bedroom, the spare one. It was at the far end of the hall, and it had a narrow bed and a dresser and a window that faced east, which meant it would get the morning light, which was more than she'd hoped for. "I'll leave you to settle," he said from the doorway. "The kitchen," she said. "Can I have full use of it?" He looked at her. "It's the kitchen. It's there for using. I mean, without interference. I'll learn the preferences. I'll manage the supplies, but I need to know that what I do in there is mine to manage." Something shifted in his expression, very slightly. She wasn't sure what it was. Surprise, maybe. Or recognition, like he'd expected her to ask something else entirely and wasn't sure what to do with the actual question. "Fine," he said. He left. She stood in the narrow bedroom for exactly 2 minutes, which was how long she allowed herself, and then she went back down the hall and into the kitchen and started taking stock. She was not going to waste daylight feeling sorry for herself. The first morning, she was up before 4. She hadn't slept particularly well. The mattress was thin, and the night sounds of the ranch were unfamiliar, and somewhere around 2 in the morning, a horse had kicked the side of a stall so hard she'd sat straight up with her heart going. But she'd been tired before. She'd cooked on worse sleep than this, in a worse kitchen than this, for people in worse moods than 12 skeptical ranch hands. She found the flour at the back of the bottom shelf, and it was almost stale. She found eggs in the cold box and bacon that was fine. She found a tin of lard and some dried herbs she didn't recognize at first until she crushed a pinch and held it under her nose and it came back to her. Sage. A little past its prime, but still good if you treated it right. She found the one cast iron skillet that was seasoned properly, and she pulled it down and set it on the stove and started moving. She wasn't thinking about impressing anyone. She was thinking about the timing. Bacon first, rendered slow, saving the fat. Biscuits into the oven now so they'd be done when the eggs needed to come off. Coffee started long before she heard the first boots on the floor because it needed to be hot and strong and waiting, not rushing to catch up. She had cooked this breakfast or something close to it 1,000 times in her life. The motions were in her hands. She didn't have to think about them. What she did think about, while her hands worked, was what her former fiancé had said to her 18 months ago, standing in the parlor of what used to be her family's house while her father's creditors were still making arrangements in the next room. His name had been Leonard, and she'd believed, genuinely believed, that he loved her. He'd been courting her for 2 years. He'd met her family. He'd sat at this very kitchen table and had her mother's pie and said it was the best thing he'd ever eaten. And then he'd stood in the parlor with his hat in his hands and told her, calmly, carefully, with the particular cruelty of a man who believes he is being reasonable, that loyalty and good cooking and a willing heart were not currencies he could spend, that a woman without family standing or money behind her was a woman he couldn't afford to be attached to, that he was sorry, but he had to think practically. He'd said the word practically the same way you'd say obviously, like she was the one being difficult for not understanding sooner. Clara had not cried in front of him. She had not cried at all until she was in her room with the door shut, and even then she'd kept it short because there were other things to do and they needed doing, and grief was something you had to schedule around necessity when you were the one everyone else depended on. But she had remembered what he said. She had filed it away next to all the other things people had told her she lacked. She was thinking about that when she heard the first voices from the bunkhouse. She put the last of the biscuits in the breadbasket. She plated the bacon on the big iron platter. She cracked the eggs into the skillet 6 at a time because there were 12 men in Silas, and she was not going to make anyone wait for a second plate if she could help it. The boots came across the yard. The door opened. She heard the laughter first, easy, thoughtless laughter, the kind between men who've been up since before dawn and have already burned through the worst of their morning mood. She heard one of them saying something about checking if the new wife had managed to boil water yet. Then they came through the door into the dining room, and the laughter stopped. Not because anything dramatic happened, not because she said anything or did anything. It stopped because they could smell it, the bacon and the biscuits and the coffee and the eggs, all of it coming together into something that smelled like a real kitchen, like a real meal, like something that hadn't been available at Redfern Ranch in a very long time. And that smell hit 12 exhausted, underfed, perpetually skeptical ranch hands somewhere past the conscious part of the brain, hit them in the part that was just animal and hungry and tired. And for a moment they all stood in the doorway and didn't say anything at all. Amos Rourke walked to the table and sat down first. He looked at the plate she'd already set out. She'd put his at the head of the table, nearest the stove and with the biggest biscuit, because she'd noticed the way he moved his knee when he thought no one was looking, and she thought the fewer steps he had to take in the morning, the better. He looked at the plate. He looked up at her. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything. But he picked up his fork, and he ate. By the time the others were seated and Clara was moving around the table with the coffee pot, the room had a different quality to it than it had the night before. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't welcome. It was just attention. 12 men paying close attention to something they hadn't expected to be paying attention to. Silas came in last. He stopped in the doorway the same way the others had, except on him it looked different, because there was something behind his expression that she couldn't read, something that tightened the line of his mouth and then released, very quickly, before he moved to his chair. She set a plate in front of him. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "You didn't have to start so early." "I know," she said. She went back to the stove. The young one, Toby, 17, with eyes that had seen something recently that they weren't finished processing, put his second biscuit in his jacket pocket when he thought no one was looking. Clara saw it. She didn't say a word. She just made a mental note. Tomorrow, more biscuits. Enough so nobody had to feel like they needed to save one. She washed the dishes after the men went out. She reorganized the pantry, pulling everything forward and taking stock of what was worth keeping and what needed to go. She made a list of supplies on a scrap of paper she found in the junk drawer, and she was specific because she had learned that vague requests led to whatever was cheapest and most available and not necessarily to what she needed. Silas came back in mid-morning and found her up on a step stool she'd found in the back hall, scrubbing the wall above the stove. He stopped. "The smoke builds up," she said, without turning around. "It makes everything taste slightly wrong over time. Most people don't notice it, but they feel it." He was quiet for a moment. "I can get one of the hands to—" "I'm already doing it." Another pause. She heard him shift his weight. "There's a loose board on the pantry shelf," she said. "Second one from the top on the left side. It needs to be re-nailed before I put anything heavy back up there. I'll have Amos look at it." "I'd rather you looked at it, if you have the minute. Amos favors his left knee, and that shelf is a reach." She felt the quality of the silence behind her change. She turned around on the step stool and looked at him directly. His face was doing that thing again, the thing where something moved across it quickly and then was gone. "You notice things," he said. It didn't come out like a compliment, and it didn't come out like a criticism. It came out like a fact he was still turning over. "It's what I do," she said. He fixed the shelf himself. That afternoon, she didn't ask him how he knew she'd noticed him notice that. She'd just heard the hammer from the pantry while she was starting on supper, and she knew. That was the first thing. Not trust, not respect, not anything close to warmth. Just a fixed shelf, and the understanding that she paid attention. Toby Crane came in from the yard late that afternoon, and hovered near the kitchen doorway in the way that 17-year-old boys hover when they want something but have decided they're too old to ask for it. Clara was making stew for supper, and she didn't look up from the pot. "Biscuit tin's on the counter," she said. "The lid's loose, so just lift it." She heard the tin open, heard the pause. "There's 3 in here," he said. "I know. The other 2 are yours if you want them. I made extra." The silence that followed lasted long enough that she did look up. Toby was standing at the counter with a biscuit in each hand and an expression on his face that was too complicated for a 17-year-old. Something between suspicious and undone, like he was trying to figure out the angle and coming up empty. "I'm not going to take them back," she said. "They'll just dry out." He ate both of them standing at the counter without another word. She went back to stirring the stew and thought about her youngest brother, who used to do the same thing in the months after their father's business failed. Eat standing up, quickly, like someone was going to stop him. Like there was a limit on being hungry that he might accidentally exceed. She knew that look. She knew exactly what it meant, and she thought, whatever else this place is or isn't, at least I know what I'm here to do. The first week, 3 of the ranch hands stopped speaking to her entirely when it became apparent she wasn't going to make herself small enough to be comfortable for them. The 4th day, one of the younger men, a red-headed kid named Burkett, who laughed too loud at his own jokes, made a comment in the dining room about how the biscuits were fine, but the cooking back in town was probably better, which made 2 other men laugh and made Amos set his fork down very slowly and look at Burkett with the kind of look that older men give younger men when they are deciding how many words it's worth using. Burkett stopped laughing. Amos didn't say anything. He just picked his fork back up and kept eating. Clara hadn't looked up from the serving dish she was filling. She had felt her face heat, not from embarrassment exactly, but from the particular kind of anger that comes from knowing you are being dismissed by someone who has not earned the authority to dismiss you. But she didn't say anything, not then. She had learned over the last 4 years the difference between the moments that required an answer and the moments that required patience. This was a patience moment. She could feel it. She was not always going to be easy to ignore, but she needed to build something first, and you couldn't build on sand. You needed the foundation to set. By the end of the 2nd week, 11 of the 12 men had begun to find reasons to be near the kitchen door at mealtimes before she called them in. Not inside, just near. Standing in the yard with their coffee cups, finding small tasks that kept them in that general direction. She noticed. She didn't mention it. Silas noticed that she noticed. She didn't mention that either. One night, the 14th night, she had started counting. She came into the kitchen after dark because she'd remembered she hadn't checked the heat on the stove, and she found him sitting at the table, not doing anything, just sitting there in the dark with his hands flat on the table in front of him. And he looked up when she came in, and neither of them said anything for a moment. She lit the lamp on the counter. "She used to sit in here," he said, not explaining who, not needing to. Clara waited. "My mother," he said, late at night when she couldn't sleep. She said the kitchen was the one room in the house that still smelled like purpose. He was looking at his hands. "This room smells like that again," he said. He got up and went to bed without looking at her. Clara stood in the kitchen for a long moment after he left. The lamp was burning low, and the stove was cooling, and the room smelled like bread and coffee and wood smoke and something underneath all of that. Something older and quieter, which might have been grief, or might have been the very first edge of something else. She was not going to name it yet. It was too early. She was a woman who had learned the cost of naming things too soon. But she knew, standing in that kitchen at the end of her 14th night at Redfern Ranch, that the foundation was beginning to set. She put her hand on the stove to check the heat. It was still warm. She counted the weeks the way she'd learned to count most things in her life, not with anticipation, but with practicality. 4 weeks in, 5, 6. She stopped counting somewhere around the 7th week because the days had started to feel less like a test she was enduring and more like a life she was actually living, and she wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. The ranch had its own rhythm, and she had learned it the way you learn a language that nobody formally teaches you, by listening, by watching, by making enough small mistakes that the corrections eventually add up to fluency. She knew now that the men needed coffee before conversation, that the 2 youngest hands, Burkett and a quiet kid named Denny, worked harder when they weren't being watched too closely, that Amos Rourke's knee was worse on the days when the weather was changing before the weather knew it was changing. She knew that Silas ate less when something was wrong with the cattle and more when a problem had been solved. She knew that Toby Crane still put food in his pocket sometimes, not out of hunger anymore, but out of habit, the way a person keeps doing something long after the reason for it is gone, because the body remembers fear even when the mind has started to relax. She knew all of these things the way she had always known the people around her, through attention, which was the one currency she had never run out of, even in the leanest years. What she hadn't expected was that the knowing would go both ways. It started with small things. The way Amos would appear at the kitchen doorway around mid-morning on the days she was doing heavy work, not offering to help, but positioning himself nearby in case she needed something lifted. The way Denny had taken to leaving the back door open in the evenings because he'd noticed, without being told, that the kitchen got hot when she was cooking for 13 people in late summer, and the cross breeze from the back made a difference. The way Burkett, who had made the comment about town cooking in the second week and never quite let go of his own embarrassment about it, had started scraping his plate clean with a thoroughness that was its own apology. She didn't make a thing of any of it, she just noticed. The pantry had become something organized enough to be useful. She had figured out the supply run schedule, every 2 weeks to Hollow Creek with the wagon, and she had started writing the lists herself rather than leaving it to whatever someone happened to remember they were out of. The first time she handed Silas a list with 14 items on it, grouped by where they'd be found in Callahan's general store, he had looked at it for a long moment. "You've been to Callahan's once," he said. "I paid attention when I was there," she said. He folded the list and put it in his shirt pocket. He didn't say anything else, but when he came back from town that afternoon, everything on the list was in the wagon, in the right quantities, including the particular kind of dried apple that she'd written at the bottom and then half crossed out because she'd thought it was too specific to expect. It wasn't crossed out enough, apparently. She didn't mention it. She put the dried apple in the tin on the second shelf and started planning what she was going to do with it. The apple pie came out on a Sunday, which was when she allowed herself something that wasn't strictly practical. She had learned that Sunday afternoons had a different quality on the ranch. The men moved slower, talked more, sat on the bunkhouse porch in a way that looked less like resting and more like being human. Even Silas tended to appear in the yard in the late afternoon rather than disappearing back toward the range, which was where he was most of the time during the week. Sunday had something in it that the other days didn't, a looseness, and Clara had started to understand it as the only time these men allowed themselves to remember that they were more than the work they did. She brought the pie out to the porch. She hadn't announced it. She hadn't asked permission. She just came out with 2 pies and set them on the porch railing and said, without looking at anyone in particular, "These need to cool for about 10 minutes if you can manage it." She went back inside. She heard the conversation stop. Heard the pause that meant 12 men were looking at 2 pies and then at each other. Heard Amos say something short and low that she couldn't make out. Heard the beginning of what sounded like an argument about who was going to go first. 10 minutes later, Toby appeared in the kitchen doorway with an empty plate and an expression she had never seen on him before. It took her a moment to identify it because she'd only seen versions of it on much younger children, a kind of uncomplicated happiness that hadn't had time yet to talk itself into something more guarded. "That's the best thing I've ever put in my mouth," he said. "That's a bold statement," she said. "You're 17. I mean it. I know you do." She cut another slice and put it on his plate. "Take that back out before someone else comes looking." He was already gone. What she didn't expect was Silas. He came into the kitchen about 20 minutes later and stood there with his hat in his hands. He always took his hat off inside, which she had noticed, and which she thought said something about him that he probably hadn't intended to say. And he looked at the kitchen counter and then at her, and then at the counter again. "Where'd you get the recipe?" he said. "My mother," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "She used dried apple in hers," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara looked at him. So did mine. Something moved across his face. She was getting better at reading his face. Not the expressions he chose to show, because those were few and controlled, but the things that happened underneath them, the small reflexes that a person couldn't entirely manage. This one was grief, fast and real and then covered over. "My mother made apple pie," he said, simply, like he was just reporting a fact. "I know," Clara said, which surprised both of them, because he'd never told her. He looked at her. "The recipe box in the pantry," she said. Third recipe in. The handwriting is different from the others. Older. The card's been handled more than the rest. He looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. Then he said, "She would have liked you." He put his hat back on and went back outside. Clara turned back to the counter and stood there for a minute with her hands flat on the surface and breathed through the specific feeling that came with someone saying something you weren't prepared for. She was not going to make it into something it wasn't. He was a grieving man who had been reminded of his mother. That was all. But she did stand there for a minute, just a minute. The thing about building something quietly is that other people eventually notice the building even if they weren't watching for it. And the thing about Hollow Creek was that it was the kind of town where people noticed things and felt entitled to have opinions about them. The first time Clara went into town alone, 3 weeks after the Pie Sunday, on a Thursday when Silas was needed at the far end of the range and sent her in with the wagon and the supply list, she understood immediately what she was walking into. Not hostility, exactly. More like the specific attentiveness of a small community that has already formed its view of something and is now curious to see how the thing in question is holding up. She'd been discussed. She could feel it in the way Miriam Callahan behind the general store counter smiled at her. Warm, but too careful. The smile of a woman who had recently been talking about someone and felt slightly exposed by their arrival. She could feel it in the way two women outside the dry goods store watched her cross the street without looking away fast enough when she noticed them looking. Clara had grown up in a small town. She knew this particular social weather. She did her shopping and was precise about it, checking each item against the list and asking twice about the quality of the flour because the last bag had been on the low end and she wasn't going to accept that again. Miriam Callahan told her the new batch had just come in from the mill and was excellent. Clara asked to see the bag. Miriam blinked. Clara smiled pleasantly and waited. Miriam showed her the bag. Clara checked it and said it would do and put it on the counter. On her way out, she passed a table near the door where an older man sat with a coffee cup and a newspaper he wasn't reading. He had the particular settled-in quality of a person who spent time in this general store, not because he needed things from it, but because it was where things happened. "Mrs. Redfern," he said, which surprised her because she still wasn't entirely used to being called that. She stopped. "Yes?" "I'm Judge Orson Pike," he said, and he said it the way a man says his own name when he expects it to mean something to the person he's talking to. It did mean something to her. She'd heard it mentioned in pieces of conversation. He was some kind of county elder, well-respected, the sort of person whose opinion people used to anchor their own. "I've heard things about Redfern Ranch," he said. "Most things people hear are partial," she said. He looked at her with something that was closer to amusement than she expected. "True enough," he said. He picked up his coffee cup. "Silas is a good man." "I know," she said. "He didn't take well to this arrangement." "I know that too." Judge Pike looked at her steadily. "You're not what people expected." "People's expectations are theirs to manage," Clara said. "Not mine." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Fair enough," and went back to his newspaper he wasn't reading, and Clara went out to the wagon and drove back to Redfern Ranch, and thought about the way he'd said fair enough in exactly the same tone Silas had said it the day she'd arrived, and wondered whether there was something in the water in this part of the country that made men default to that particular phrase when a woman said something they didn't have a ready answer for. The trouble with Lenora Whitcomb announced itself like weather, not all at once, but in the particular thickening of the air before a storm. Clara first heard the name from Toby, who mentioned it sideways in the way that young people mention things they think might be important, but aren't sure how much trouble they're going to cause by saying it. He was in the kitchen getting an extra biscuit. This had become a reliable daily occurrence, and he said, not looking at her, "Mrs. Whitcomb was in town asking about you." Clara kept her hands moving. "What kind of asking?" Toby shrugged, but it wasn't a relaxed shrug. The kind where she's not really asking, she's just making sure everyone knows she's interested. Clara let that sit for a moment. "How long has she had her eye on Silas?" Toby looked up, looked down again. "Since about a year after her husband died, which was 2 years ago. She's got a daughter, Vivian. Everyone sort of assumed—" He stopped. "That Silas would marry Vivian," Clara said. "I mean, Lenora assumed it," Toby said, and there was something careful in the way he said it that she appreciated. He was 17 and trying to be fair. Silas never said anything one way or the other, far as I know. But she's the kind of person who takes silence as agreement. Clara filed this information in the place where she kept things she needed to think about but couldn't afford to spend energy on yet. How much influence does she have in Hollow Creek? Toby made a face that was its own answer. Right, Clara said. Biscuit tins on the counter. She saw Lenora Whitcomb for the first time 4 days later, on a morning when she hadn't slept well, and the stove had taken 3 tries to light properly, and she was already running 15 minutes behind the schedule she kept in her head. Lenora came to the ranch without announcement or invitation, which Clara would come to understand was simply how Lenora operated, because the world had rewarded her enough times for arriving where she wanted to be that she'd stopped asking permission to be there. Clara heard the horse in the yard. She heard Silas's voice saying something short and flat, and then a woman's voice responding, a voice that had been trained to sound like warmth, but had the specific quality of warmth that exists only as a delivery mechanism for something else. She kept working. Lenora came into the kitchen like she'd been in it before. She probably had. She was a handsome woman in her mid-40s, dressed better than the morning justified, and she moved through the kitchen with the deliberate ease of someone who is performing comfort rather than feeling it. She stopped in the middle of the room and looked at Clara the way Amos had looked at her hands on the day she arrived, like an object being assessed. "So you're the one," she said. Clara turned from the stove. "Mrs. Whitcomb, I'd offer coffee, but I imagine this isn't a social visit." Lenora's mouth curved slightly. "I just wanted to see for myself. People in town have been talking." "People in town talk about the weather too," Clara said. "I try not to take it personally." "They're saying Silas has settled," Lenora said, and she used the word settled in a way that was meant to land like a stone in still water, with visible rings spreading outward. Clara looked at her. "He has a working ranch, a good crew, and a household that's functioning. I'd call that successful, not settled." "You would." Lenora picked up a wooden spoon from the counter, the way she'd picked up the biscuit that morning. Clara would think about later, handling it with fingers that had decided not to be impressed before they touched it. "You must find it satisfying, cooking for a pack of rough men who'd eat anything set in front of them." "They'd tell you otherwise," Clara said. "Would they?" It wasn't really a question. "I'm sure they appreciate what you're doing here. I'm sure it's comfortable for them. But comfort isn't the same as quality, is it?" Clara looked at her steadily. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which was beating with a specific and particular frustration that she was managing the way she managed most difficult things, by not letting it into her hands. Her hands stayed even. "Was there something you needed, Mrs. Whitcomb?" she said. "I have bread in the oven." Lenora set the spoon back down, very deliberately. The way you set something down when you want the person watching you to understand that you're choosing to release it, not that it ever had any hold on you. "I'll say hello to Silas," she said. She left. Clara turned back to the stove and exhaled once, short and controlled, and then picked up the wooden spoon and went back to what she'd been doing. The bread was fine. She'd been watching the time. But she stood there for a moment after Lenora was gone and thought about the way the woman had moved through this kitchen, like she was already calculating what she'd change, like the room was an inconvenience she planned to resolve. Clara thought, no, just that, just the one word. Firm and flat and entirely internal. No. She heard Silas's voice in the yard going short and uncomfortable, and Lenora's voice staying easy and social, and after a few minutes the horse left at a pace that managed to suggest the rider was in no particular hurry. Silas came into the kitchen. Clara didn't look at him. "Bread's almost done," she said. "I didn't invite her," he said. "I know." "She doesn't—" He stopped, started again. "She has a habit of—" "Silas," Clara said, finally turning. "I'm not asking you to explain her. I'm just telling you the bread's almost done." He looked at her. Something in his face was working through something complicated that he hadn't resolved yet. She understood. She didn't need him to have resolved it today. What she needed was for him to see what was happening and not talk himself out of what he'd seen, and that was going to take the time it was going to take. "She'll come back," he said. "Probably," Clara said. "I'll be here." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, small, just a chin drop, and went back out. The bread came out right. It always came out right when she was angry because she was precise when she was angry. Every measurement exact, every timing deliberate. Her mother had told her once that her best cooking happened when she was feeling something difficult, and Clara had thought at the time it was just something mothers said. She understood now that it was true. There was something in the needing to be controlled that sharpened every instinct she had. She set the bread on the counter to cool. Lenora came back twice more in the next 2 weeks, both times without invitation, both times with the same performance of casual comfort. The second time she brought her daughter Vivian, who was 23 and beautiful in the specific way of young women who have been told their whole lives that beauty is a plan, which it was, in this case, and Vivian seemed to understand the terms of the plan without necessarily being entirely committed to them. Vivian was not unkind. That was the thing Clara noticed. She was being steered, not steering, and there was something in her eyes when she looked around the kitchen, something that wasn't rivalry so much as wistfulness, as if she was looking at a life she wouldn't have chosen but wasn't entirely opposed to having. Clara gave her a slice of the apple cake she'd made that morning because it was there, and Vivian had looked at it, and the look was just honest hunger, uncalculated, and Clara could not resist that. Vivian ate it like she hadn't expected it to be good, and was then surprised that it was. "This is lovely," she said. "Thank you. Did you learn from someone or—" "My mother," Clara said, "and years of necessity." Vivian looked at her. "That combination seems to produce better results than either alone." Clara looked at her. "Yes," she said, "it does." Lenora chose this moment to come back in from wherever she'd gone and found her daughter eating cake at Clara's kitchen table and having what appeared to be a genuine conversation, and the expression that crossed Lenora's face was not quite anger, but was the close neighbor of anger, something that recognized a disruption to the arrangement without knowing yet how to address it. "Vivian," she said, with the particular tone mothers use when they need their child to stop doing something, without saying specifically what or why. Vivian set down the fork. But she looked at Clara first, and there was something in that look, an apology maybe, or a recognition, the kind that passes between two people who understand more of each other's situation than either of them has said out loud. And then she stood and followed her mother out. Clara cleared the plate. She wasn't sure what had just happened exactly, except that something in the geometry of the situation had shifted slightly, and she needed to pay attention to it. 3 days later, Lenora Whitcomb announced a county dinner. She came to tell Silas about it herself, standing in the yard with her best social manner fully engaged, the warmth dialed up to something that felt almost genuine at the distance of a few feet. She was inviting the Redferns, she said the Redferns, the plural, which Clara noted, to host the gathering at their ranch. It was a tradition, she said, the autumn social. Hollow Creek's most prominent families, Judge Pike and his wife, the Harlan brothers who ran the Eastern Farms, the minister and his wife, a few others. The Redferns had hosted it 3 years running before the arrangement had lapsed. She said lapsed the way you say a word you've already decided the meaning of. She thought it would be good to revive the tradition. She thought Redfern Ranch was the natural setting. She also said, and this was where the warmth acquired a specific edge, like a glove with a nail in the palm, that she would be bringing a cook from the city, someone who had experience with this kind of entertaining. She said this looking at Clara. Clara did not look away. Silas said he'd think on it. Lenora said, warmly, that she hoped he would. She left, and Silas stood in the yard for a moment, and then came inside and sat down at the kitchen table and said, "You understand what she's doing?" "Yes," Clara said. "I can tell her no." "You can?" Clara said. She was making the dough for tomorrow's bread, working it on the floured board with the heels of her hands. "But Hollow Creek will hear that Redfern Ranch wouldn't host the autumn social, and they'll ask why." "I don't care what Hollow Creek—" "You should care a little," she said, not unkindly. "Not because of what they think of you, because of what they think of the ranch. Your men work this land. Their reputation is yours. You care about that." He was quiet. "She wants me to fail publicly," Clara said. "She's going to bring someone better trained and better supplied, and she wants the county watching when the comparison gets made." "Then we say no." "Or," Clara said, "we say yes." She heard the slight shift in his chair. "You're not worried about it." "I'm very worried about it," she said, "but I'm not afraid of it. There's a difference." She could feel him watching her work the dough. His attention was its own kind of weight, and she had grown more aware of it over the weeks. The particular quality of Silas's attention, which was not casual, was never casual, came from somewhere that cost him something to give. "What would you make?" he said. She almost smiled. She kept it out of her face. "What I always make." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have," she said. "I don't have a city cook's training. I can't compete with technique. What I have is what I've always had." She paused in her work, pressing her palms flat against the dough. "My mother's pie. The bread you've all been eating for 6 weeks. The things that came from needing to feed people and having to figure out how." He was quiet for a long moment. "All right," he said. "Just that. All right." Like it was decided, and he was going with her on it, and he'd made a choice that he intended to stand behind. Clara went back to working the dough. She felt the thing in her chest that she still didn't have a name for, the one that showed up when Silas did something that demonstrated he was paying attention in the way that cost something. And she pressed it down, carefully, the way she pressed the dough, because it wasn't time yet, and she was not going to rush it. She started planning the menu that night at the table after supper, when everyone had gone and the kitchen was quiet. She wrote it on the back of a supply list because she hadn't thought to bring paper, and the list itself was a kind of record. What the ranch had needed, what she'd learned to provide, the slow accumulation of attention and adjustment that had made this household into something that functioned. She wrote, "Slow stew, honey bread, apple pie." She looked at it. Then she added, "More biscuits, always more biscuits." She put the pen down. Outside, the wind was picking up, the first real edge of autumn in it, the kind of cold that smells like change. She could hear it moving through the yard, pressing against the windows, finding the gaps the old house had accumulated. The ranch settled around her the way it had started to do. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way of something that has been in motion long enough that you stop noticing the motion and start noticing only the direction. She folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket. There was work to do, and she intended to do it, and Lenora Whitcomb was going to watch her do it in front of every important person in Hollow Creek. Clara was not particularly interested in winning. She was interested in being seen clearly for what she was, not more, not less. She had learned, in the years of her father's failure and Leonard's abandonment and the slow grind of rebuilding, that what you actually were mattered more than how you were perceived, in the long run. People's perceptions had a way of aligning eventually with the truth, if the truth was consistent enough and long enough and honest enough. She was prepared to be consistent. She had been consistent her whole life. What she hadn't expected, what she genuinely hadn't allowed herself to plan for, was Silas standing up from the table the next morning after breakfast, when the men were still carrying their plates to the counter, and saying, to no one in particular, but in the way that meant he intended everyone to hear, "Clara's handling the dinner. I want everyone to understand that. Whatever she needs, she gets." He went back outside. The room was quiet for a moment in the specific way it gets quiet when something has been said that changes the arrangement of things. Amos looked at the door Silas had gone through. Then he looked at Clara, and he nodded. Once, the same chin drop she was starting to recognize as the Redfern Ranch version of a long speech, and picked up his hat and followed Silas out. Toby caught her eye on his way to the door. He grinned. 17 years old and completely unself-conscious about it. The most uncomplicated grin she'd seen since she got here. She didn't grin back. She kept her face straight. But she did wait until he was gone before she allowed herself the smallest possible version of a smile. Just for a moment, just for herself. Then she started on the dishes, because the dishes needed doing, and there was a dinner to prepare for, and she had exactly 16 days to make something out of the food she knew, and the hands she'd been born with, and the years of necessity that had made her what she was. 16 days. She had worked with less. The 16 days passed the way difficult days always do when you're inside them. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular texture of time that has been filled to its edges with purpose. Clara worked through them methodically, the way she worked through most things, which was without ceremony and without wasted motion, and with the consistent understanding that what she was building had to be solid enough to hold weight when the weight actually arrived. She had never cooked for 23 people at once. She did not say this out loud. She did the arithmetic privately, adjusted quantities, mapped out a timeline that worked backward from the dinner hour, and told her exactly when each thing needed to start. She burned one batch of test biscuits on the fourth day because she was using the oven at a higher temperature to account for the volume and miscalculated the time. And she stood over the blackened pan in the kitchen and felt the specific frustration of a mistake that was entirely her own fault and entirely correctable. And then she scraped the pan, adjusted the temperature down by 15 degrees, and started again. She did not tell anyone about the burned biscuits. Toby, who had been lingering near the back door at the precise wrong moment, also did not tell anyone about the burned biscuits. She caught his eye through the window and he made a gesture that she interpreted as meaning, "I saw nothing," and went back to whatever he'd been doing, and she thought, not for the first time, that 17 was an underestimated age. Silas had not inserted himself into the preparation. This was what she needed from him, and also, she recognized, what it cost him. He was not a man built for standing aside when something important was happening on his land. She could feel the restraint in him on the evenings when he came into the kitchen and found her at the table with her lists and her timing charts and her notes to herself. And he would pour himself a cup of coffee and sit across from her without asking questions, which was its own form of presence. And she had started to understand that this was how Silas Redfern showed support. Not with words, not with interference, just with the willingness to be in the room. She could work with that. The city cook arrived 2 days before the dinner, which was not something she had anticipated. His name was apparently Bernard. She heard this from Toby, who had been in town and witnessed the arrival. And he came with 2 large trunks of equipment and a manner that suggested he had cooked for people considerably more important than the county families of Hollow Creek, and wanted this understood from the beginning. Lenora had arranged for him to use the kitchen at her own house for the preparation, which meant Clara didn't see him directly, but she felt his presence the way you feel something gathering on the horizon. On the morning of the dinner, she was up at 3. The stove was lit by 3:15. She had the stew started by 4, the slow-cooked one, the one that needed the full day to become what it needed to be. Beef and root vegetables and herbs that she had been drying since early September because she'd wanted them at precisely the right stage. She had prepped the dough for the honey bread the night before, so it could rise overnight in the cold and then come back to room temperature slowly, which gave it the particular density and pull that fast-risen dough never managed to achieve. The pie shells were ready. She would fill them mid-afternoon. She had not slept much. She was aware of this the way you're aware of something you've decided not to allow to be a problem. Amos appeared in the kitchen doorway at 5:30. She hadn't heard him coming. The man could move quietly when he chose to, which she had learned was its own form of ranch skill, the ability to go unannounced. He looked at the stove, at the pot, at the bread dough covered on the counter, and then at Clara, who was already flour-dusted and moving. "What do you need?" he said. She looked at him. "I thought you had fence work this morning." "I rescheduled it." She was quiet for a moment. "The dining table needs to come in from the storage barn. It's the long one, the extension kind. And the chairs." "I know where it is. There's a crack in one of the legs that needs to be checked before we put weight on it." "I'll check it." He turned to go. She said, "Amos?" He stopped. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. The chin drop. He went. Denny and Burkett appeared an hour later, both of them slightly awkward in the way of men who want to help and haven't had a lot of practice offering it without being asked. Burkett, she had come to understand, expressed himself almost entirely through action. He was better with his hands than his words, and had learned early that talking usually got him into more trouble than just doing the thing. He came in, looked at the state of the kitchen, and started washing the pans she'd already used and set to the side. Denny went around to the yard and started bringing in wood for the extra stove she'd asked to have moved inside, which was the bunkhouse heating stove, small but functional, and which she needed for the second oven's worth of capacity. She hadn't asked either of them to come. She hadn't known they would. She stood for a moment in the middle of the kitchen, watching 2 men who 3 months ago had been skeptical of her existence quietly rearranging themselves around what she needed. And she felt something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite satisfaction, but was in the territory of both. Something that felt like the specific answer to a question she had stopped letting herself ask. She went back to the bread. The guests began arriving at 5. Clara heard the first wagon from the kitchen and made herself focus on the temperature of the oven. She could hear the voices in the yard, the social warmth of people who see each other regularly and perform the ritual of reunion every time. And underneath it, she could hear Silas's voice, which was lower and less socially practiced and therefore more recognizable. I was being a host. He was doing it adequately but stiffly, the way you do something you've been told is necessary but haven't internalized as natural. She had told him that morning, "You don't have to stay near the kitchen. Be with your guests." He had said, "I know where I'd rather be." She hadn't answered that. Lenora arrived with Bernard and an air of organized confidence that was probably visible from the road. Clara knew this because Toby reported it. He had constituted himself as a kind of informal intelligence service throughout the preparation, not obviously, just appearing periodically with information he thought she could use and then disappearing again before she could make too much of it. He told her that Bernard had brought serving dishes with silver rims. He told her that Lenora had on the green dress that meant she was serious about something. He told her that Vivian had come too, which hadn't been announced, and that Vivian had looked at the house when they pulled in with an expression he couldn't describe exactly, but which he said looked like someone seeing a thing they'd thought about a lot and finding it different from what they'd imagined. Clara filed this and kept moving. The dining room had been set with everything Amos had managed to pull together. The long table, extended to its full reach, covered with the best cloth Clara had found in the linen press upstairs and washed and pressed 2 days ago. 12 chairs on each side, Judge Pike and his wife at one end, Silas at the other. The lamps were lit along the center. It was not elegant, but it was warm, and it was clean, and it was honest in the way that the house itself was honest, which was without pretension and without apology. Bernard set up his dishes in the side room Lenora had arranged to use. Clara could hear the particular sounds of professional kitchen work, quick and precise and slightly too loud in the way of someone who is used to a larger space. She caught the smell of something rich and cream-based coming through the wall and thought, with complete honesty, that it smelled good. Bernard clearly knew what he was doing. She looked at her stew. It smelled like winter. It smelled like the inside of a house, when the cold is outside and the food is ready and the people are almost home. It smelled like something her mother had made on the first hard frost of every year and called, without ceremony, what people need when the season turns. She took a breath and started plating the bread. Dinner began with Bernard's dish, a cream bisque with something delicate and herb-forward that Clara, listening from the kitchen, could hear receiving compliments in the specific tone that people use for things that are impressive and unfamiliar. She heard Lenora's voice, smooth and satisfied. She heard Judge Pike say something that drew polite laughter. She heard the sounds of a room settling into the performance of a successful social event. She was not going to try to match it. She had always known that. She was going to do the thing she actually knew how to do and trust that it would be enough. And if it wasn't enough, she was going to have to live with that in the cleanest way possible. Amos came through the kitchen. "They're ready." She looked at the pots, at the bread, at the 3 pies cooling on the side counter. "Let's go," she said. The stew came out in the big iron pot that she'd been given as part of the kitchen inventory and which had probably cooked 10,000 meals without complaint. And she put it in the center of the table with the ladle and the honey bread alongside it, and the room underwent a change in quality that she felt before she could measure it. The smell arrived before anything else. It arrived the way a memory arrives, not as information, but as feeling, arriving in the chest before the mind has time to process it. She watched it happen across the faces at the table, the small, involuntary pause, the slight refocusing of attention. Judge Pike was the first one to reach for the bread. She went back to the kitchen. She had more to do. She was cutting the pies when she heard it. Judge Pike's voice carrying from the dining room with the particular ease of a man who is used to rooms listening when he speaks. "I will say, in 40 years of eating at good tables in 4 different states, I cannot recall bread with this quality of texture." Silence. Then Lenora's voice, controlled but with something underneath it. "Bernard's bisque was exceptional." "It was very good," Judge Pike said. And then, with the casual authority of a man who doesn't need to be careful because everyone in the room already knows he won't be challenged, "The bread is better than meals I've eaten in hotels that charged accordingly." Clara stood in the kitchen with the pie server in her hand. She heard the room recalibrate. She heard the nature of the conversation shift in the way conversations shift when an authority has expressed an opinion and the room is deciding how to arrange itself around it. She heard 2 or 3 other voices coming in, and she couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the tone, which was the tone of agreement and elaboration. She heard Lenora say something about the bisque again. The room was polite about it. She finished cutting the pie and carried it out herself. She set the first one in front of Judge Pike. He looked at it. He looked at her. He said, "Mrs. Redfern," with the particular inflection of a man paying genuine attention. She went back for the second pie. When she came back through the dining room, she passed near where Silas was sitting, and she did not look at him. She was focused on the table and the placement and making sure the second pie sat level, and then she was going back towards the kitchen, and she heard him say quietly, not to the room, just to her, as she passed, "Clara." She stopped. She looked at him. He was looking at her with something on his face that she had not seen there before, and she could not identify all the components of it, but one of the components was pride, unambiguous and unguarded, and it arrived in her chest like a hand placed flat over the sternum. "Everything's good," he said. She looked at him for a second longer than she intended. Then she said, "I know," and went back to the kitchen. She stood at the counter and breathed for a moment. Then she put the kettle on for coffee because they were going to want coffee, and she had work to do. Lenora left before the second round of coffee was finished. Not dramatically. She was not a woman who made dramatic exits, because dramatic exits acknowledge that something has not gone the way you intended, and Lenora Whitcomb would not acknowledge that. She left the way a tide goes out, which is without announcement and in the direction of its own convenience. She thanked Silas graciously. She complimented the house, in a way that managed to avoid specifically complimenting the meal. She touched Vivian's arm in a way that meant we're leaving, and Vivian stood and did what she was told, but she looked at Clara on her way to the door. That look again, the one with the apology in it, the one that said, "I know what this is, and I'm sorry, and I don't know what to do about it." And Clara nodded at her once, small and acknowledgeable, because Vivian hadn't asked to be part of this, and she wasn't the problem. Bernard left with his silver-rimmed dishes and his 2 trunks and his professional efficiency, and Clara had no particular feelings about Bernard, who had done his job and done it well, and was not responsible for the purpose he'd been recruited for. The remaining guests stayed another hour. Judge Pike's wife, a small woman named Ruth, who had said almost nothing all evening, but who had eaten with a steadiness that Clara found more meaningful than any compliment, came into the kitchen on her own near the end of the night, and stood in the doorway and looked at the room. "My mother had a kitchen that smelled like this," she said. Clara was washing a pot. "What did she cook?" "Everything," Ruth said. "The way you do when you're cooking because people are hungry, not because you're trying to be impressive." She paused. "This was a good night, Mrs. Redfern." She went back to the dining room. Clara finished the pot and started on the next one. The night she could have counted as a victory. She chose to count it as a data point, which was more useful. It told her that what she had was sufficient, that she did not need to become something different, that the honest version of herself was adequate for what this life required. That was not a small thing to know. It was, in fact, one of the most useful pieces of information she had collected in some time. She went to bed that night with clean hands, and the particular exhaustion of a day that had asked a great deal and received it, and she slept deeply for the first time in 2 weeks. She should have known it wouldn't last. The rumor started the way most things start in small towns, which is without a clear point of origin that anyone will later admit to. It didn't arrive as a single statement or a direct accusation. It arrived in pieces, the way bad weather arrives, a comment here, a suggestion there, the careful accumulation of implication that doesn't commit to any single provable lie, but creates, in aggregate, an atmosphere in which the truth becomes uncertain. She heard it first from the most unlikely source. Ruth Pike appeared at Redfern Ranch on a Wednesday afternoon, 11 days after the dinner, and asked to see Clara alone. This was unusual enough that Clara felt the shape of it before Ruth said anything. A woman who had come out of her way to deliver something privately was bringing something she didn't want overheard. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and Ruth turned her cup in her hands the way people do when they're deciding how to begin, and then she said, "I need to tell you something I'd rather not have to tell you." "All right," Clara said. "There is talk in Hollow Creek," Ruth said, "about your past, specifically about why you left your home. The talk is, it's not kind. It's suggesting something that I suspect is not true, but it is spreading, and I think you should know before it gets worse." Clara looked at her. "What exactly is the talk saying?" Ruth set down the cup. "That you were sent away, by your own family, for something you did that was, the word being used is disgrace, Nobody is saying specifically what the disgrace was, which makes it worse, because people fill in what they're not told. She paused. It's the kind of thing that's designed to leave you unable to defend yourself, because there's nothing specific to deny. Clara was quiet for a moment. She felt the cold move through her. Not the autumn cold from outside, which was real and had been deepening all week, but the interior cold that comes from recognizing something you feared as a specific threat rather than an abstract one. "Does Silas know?" she said. "I don't know," Ruth said. "Orson doesn't say everything he hears, but people talk to each other, and the ranch hands go into town." Clara looked at her hands flat on the table. "Thank you for telling me. I thought you deserved to know." After Ruth left, Clara sat at the table for a while. Not long. She allowed herself the time it took to feel the full weight of what she was dealing with, because she had learned that skipping that step didn't actually eliminate the weight, it just distributed it differently, and the distribution always showed up eventually in ways you hadn't planned for. This was Lenora. She was certain of it, though she had no proof and suspected she never would. It was too well constructed to be accident. The vagueness was deliberate, the source untraceable, the nature of the accusation exactly calibrated to be unanswerable. You couldn't prove a negative, couldn't demonstrate the absence of a disgrace without somehow giving the disgrace more reality by addressing it. The question was not whether it was Lenora. The question was what to do about it. She thought about what Leonard had said, standing in the parlor with his hat in his hands, about her father, who had spent the last year of his business trying to answer the questions that creditors and neighbors and former associates asked, and who had discovered that answering only gave more surface area to attack. She thought about the years between that parlor and this kitchen, the slow accumulation of days in which she had done the actual work of being who she was without asking anyone's permission to be it. She thought, I have been afraid of this my whole life. Someone deciding I'm unwanted and saying it out loud where everyone can hear. And then she thought, being afraid of it didn't stop it. She got up from the table and started on supper. Silas came in that evening later than usual. She could tell from the specific quality of his silence when he sat down at the kitchen table. Not the companionable silence she had gotten used to, but a heavier one, with something in it that was braced, that he had heard something. She didn't push. She put a plate in front of him and poured the coffee and let him sit with whatever he was carrying. He was halfway through the plate when he said, without looking up, "I heard something in town." "I know," she said. He looked up. "Ruth Pike came this afternoon," she said. He set down his fork. "Clara, don't," she said. Not harshly, just steadily. "Don't apologize for something you didn't do, and don't defend me to me. I don't need that right now." He looked at her. The thing on his face was complicated, and she let it be complicated. "What do you need?" he said. It was, she thought, the most useful question anyone had asked her in years. Not what happened, not are you all right, not how can I fix this, just what do you need? She thought about it honestly. "I need to not disappear," she said. "That's what this is designed to make me do. Hide, become smaller, wait for it to pass." She paused. "I'm not going to do that." "What are you going to do?" "The autumn social is in 3 weeks," she said. "The county one, at the Harlan property." He looked at her steadily. "I'm going to go," she said. "We'll both go," he said. It came out without hesitation, which she noted. "You should know what you're agreeing to," she said. "People are going to be watching to see how I carry it. If I seem, I know what I'm agreeing to," he said. She held his gaze. "All right," she said. He went back to his plate. She went back to the stove. The kitchen held the two of them in the way it had started to hold them. Not comfortably exactly, but honestly, without the pretense that things were simpler than they were. The days between the discovery of the rumor and the autumn social were the hardest she had spent on Redfern Ranch. Not because the work changed. The work was the same. The meals and the planning and the daily management of a household that had started to run well and required maintenance to stay that way. But the weight underneath the work was different. She carried the knowledge of what was being said about her the way you carry a splinter in your palm that you can't get clean. Not incapacitating, but present in every pressure. She noticed the change in town when she went for supplies. Not everyone. The Callahans were the same, and old Mr. Terrence at the feed store hadn't apparently heard or didn't care. But two women who had been friendly after the dinner now found reasons to be engaged with something else when she came near. The man at the hardware counter was slower to help than he'd been. These were small things. They were the kind of small things that accumulated into an atmosphere. She brought home the supplies and unpacked them and made supper and went to bed and got up and did it again. The ranch hands, to their considerable credit, behaved exactly as they had been behaving. She was not sure whether this was because they hadn't heard, or because they had heard and had made a decision, or because the kitchen table had become sufficiently important to them that they had simply decided the arrangement was worth more than the outside noise. She suspected the last, and she was grateful for it in a way she didn't know how to express, and so didn't try to. Amos came into the kitchen on the second week and stood at the counter while she was working. This was his version of checking in, she had learned. He didn't ask questions directly, he just put himself nearby and waited to see if something needed to be said. She was making the dough for tomorrow. She worked it without looking at him. "I've been on this ranch 22 years, Amos said. He wasn't looking at her either. He was looking out the window at the yard. Knew Silas's father, knew his mother better, because she was the one who actually ran things. Woman worked herself half to death holding this place together. Clara kept working. People talked about her too, he said, when she first came here. Said she was too educated for ranch life, too particular. Said she'd be gone by winter." He paused. "She stayed 31 years. He went back outside. Clara stopped working the dough for a moment. Just a moment. Then she picked up where she'd left off. The morning of the autumn social, she made her mother's spiced apple pie from memory. She didn't need the recipe card, hadn't needed it for years. The proportions were in her hands. The timing was in her sense of the smell. The moment when the filling had arrived at exactly what it needed to be registered in her body before it registered in her mind. She made 2 pies because one felt like hedging, and she didn't want to hedge. She dressed carefully, not expensively. She didn't have expensive clothes and wasn't going to pretend otherwise, but carefully, which was its own form of respect. For herself. For the occasion. For the woman she was choosing to be by walking through the door of that event without apology. Silas was waiting at the wagon. He had shaved, which he didn't always do on days off, and he had his good hat, and he looked at her when she came out carrying the pie boxes, and he said nothing, but he took both boxes from her and put them in the wagon bed with a steadiness that said he knew what they cost and he wasn't going to let them come to harm. She climbed up. He climbed up. They rode toward Hollow Creek in the kind of silence that was not uncomfortable anymore. The kind she had come to understand as simply how Silas moved through significant moments, which was with his mouth closed and his attention fully given. She had been afraid, in the abstract, for 3 weeks. Sitting in the wagon, watching the road unroll ahead of them in the thin October light, she noticed that the fear had become something else. Not confidence, exactly. She wasn't going to dress it up into something more heroic than it was. More like clarity. She knew what she was going into, and she knew what she had decided the second was sufficient for the first. That was all it was. Sufficient. Not triumphant, just sufficient. The Harlan property was decorated for the season, dried corn stalks and pumpkins, and the kind of effort that speaks to a family that takes these events seriously. Wagons were already lined up along the fence. She could hear voices from inside the barn where the gathering was held. The communal warmth of 100 people who have all known each other long enough to have accumulated both affection and old grievances. She picked up both pie boxes from the wagon bed before Silas could get to them. He looked at her. "I need to carry them in myself," she said. He understood. He held the door. She walked in. The room did not go silent. Rooms don't actually go silent the way they do in stories. What happened was a change in the quality of the noise. Conversations that had been running on their own current shifted slightly, redirected by the arrival of something that people were paying attention to. She felt the shift the way you feel a change in wind direction, not by seeing it, but by what it does to everything around it. She looked for the food table. She found it against the far wall. She walked toward it with the pie boxes, and she did not look left or right, and she did not look to see who was watching. She set the pies down. She turned around. Lenora Whitcomb was standing 12 feet away with 2 other women who were slightly behind her in the specific configuration that indicates followers rather than equals. And Lenora was looking at Clara with the composed expression of someone who has arranged this moment to their liking and is curious to see whether it goes according to plan. Clara met her eyes. She did not smile. She did not look away. Lenora opened her mouth, and Judge Orson Pike's voice, carrying from across the room with the calm authority of a man who had made up his mind about something some time ago and had been waiting for the appropriate moment. Mrs. Redfern. She turned. He was standing with a small group that included the Harlan brothers and two women she didn't recognize. He was looking at her with the specific look of a man who is doing something deliberate and knows it and intends to be known to know it. "I was hoping you'd come," he said. "I've been telling these folks about the bread from the Redfern dinner, and they thought I was exaggerating." He was looking at the pie. "Tell me that's the apple," he said. She said, "Spiced apple, my mother's recipe," he said with the pleasant finality of a man making an announcement rather than having a conversation. "I look forward to telling you myself that it's the finest thing I've eaten this year." The room heard. It was designed to. He had used his voice at exactly the volume that would carry to exactly the distance it needed to carry. Clara held herself steady. She said, "I hope it holds up." "I suspect it will," he said. She turned back toward the food table, and she was aware, without looking, without needing to look, of what was happening in the room behind her, the realignment, the recalibration, the specific social physics of a county community responding to the expressed opinion of a man whose opinion they had used as an anchor for 40 years. Lenora was still standing 12 feet away. Clara did not look at her. She straightened the pie boxes on the table, adjusted the angle slightly, made sure they were sitting level, because the table was old and had a slight tilt to the left, and if you didn't compensate for it, things slid. She heard Silas behind her. Not close. He had moved to the side of the room, where Amos was standing, because Amos had come to the social, because Amos had decided to come to the social, and she had not known that until she saw him there, and the sight of him standing against the barn wall with his hat in his hands. At a social event he categorically did not attend had done something to her that she was going to have to deal with later when she was alone. She was not going to deal with it now. She turned back to the room. She had arrived. She was here. She was standing, upright, in this room that the rumor had tried to make uninhabitable for her, and she was not diminished, and she was not hiding, and the pies were on the table, and they were good, and she knew they were good, and that knowledge was the most solid thing she had. She was not finished. She understood that. Lenora was not the kind of problem that resolved in a single evening. The social physics of a small community moved in more than one direction, and the ground could shift again. But she was here. And for right now, that was the whole thing. The wagon ride home from the Harlan property took 40 minutes on a good road, and the road that night was not particularly good. The October cold had gotten into the ruts from the last rain and hardened them at odd angles, so the wagon jolted and shifted in a way that made conversation difficult and silence natural. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and watched the dark countryside move past and let the evening settle into something she could actually look at. The pies had gone. Both of them, completely, down to the last crumb scraped from the pan by a man named Harlan Jr., who had the grace to look slightly embarrassed about it. Judge Pike had eaten 2 slices and made no attempt to be subtle about the fact. Ruth Pike had found Clara near the end of the evening and pressed her hand briefly and said nothing, which was more than enough. 3 women who had been cool toward her in the weeks since the rumor started had come to the food table while she was standing near it and spoken to her directly. Not about the rumor, not in a way that addressed anything explicitly, but in the way of people who are quietly choosing a side by the simple act of choosing to speak. Lenora had left an hour before the end, again, without drama, the tide going out. But the thing Clara was turning over, the thing she couldn't quite set down, was not Lenora, and it was not the pie, and it was not even Judge Pike's very public and very deliberate show of support, which she was still processing in terms of what it cost him and what it meant that he'd chosen to spend it. It was Amos. She kept coming back to Amos standing against the barn wall in his good shirt with his hat in his hands. Amos Rourke, who had looked at her soft hands the day she arrived and said nothing and meant everything. Amos, who had eaten her first breakfast with the focused silence of a man deciding something and never quite told her what he'd decided. Amos, who had fixed the table and checked the chair leg and rescheduled fence work on the morning of the county dinner without being asked and without making anything of it. Amos, who did not go to socials, who had not been to one, as far as she could tell from anything anyone had said, in several years. She had not spoken to him at the social. There had been too much happening, and she hadn't wanted to make it awkward by acknowledging the significance of his being there. Because men like Amos Rourke did not generally respond well to having the significance of things pointed out to them. But she had seen him, and he had made sure she saw him, and that was the whole thing, really. That was what he'd come to do. She was still thinking about it when Silas pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and set the brake and sat there for a moment without getting down. She waited. He said, "You did well tonight." "I stood there and let other people do most of it," she said. "That's not what I watched," he said. She looked at him. In the dark, she couldn't read his face clearly, which was probably why he'd chosen to say it now. Some men found it easier to speak when they didn't have to watch the effect of the words. "I watched you walk into a room that was supposed to make you feel unwelcome," he said, "and I watched you stand in it like it was yours." She was quiet for a moment. "It is mine," she said. Not the Harlan barn. She meant something else, and she thought he understood that. "I know," he said. He got down from the wagon. He came around and put his hand up to help her down, which he hadn't done before. He'd always let her manage it herself, which she'd read as respect for her competence rather than indifference, and she still read it that way. And she took his hand and stepped down, and they were close for a moment in the cold dark, close enough that she could see his face after all. He let go of her hand one finger at a time. Not quickly. She went inside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment in the dark before she lit the lamp, and she pressed her hand flat on the stove the way she always did to check the residual heat, and the stove was warm from the morning's work, still holding it, the way good iron holds heat long after the fire is out. She did not sleep easily that night, not because anything was wrong, something had shifted toward right, in fact, and she was aware of that, but because her mind was doing what it did when a situation changed shape and needed to be re-understood in its new form. She lay in the narrow bed in the east-facing room and looked at the ceiling and let her mind work through it without trying to rush it toward conclusions. The rumor wasn't finished. She was clear-eyed about that. One evening and one very public show of support from Judge Pike had changed the atmosphere but not eliminated the source, and Lenora was not a woman who rethought her objectives simply because the first approach hadn't worked. She would find another angle. Clara didn't know what it would be, but she knew it was coming, and she thought knowing it was coming was probably the most useful thing she could have going into whatever came next. She fell asleep somewhere around 2. She was up before 4. November came in like a door closing. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a single week, and the sky took on the flat white quality that Amos said meant real winter was 6 weeks out, maybe less. The men's work shifted. More time near the herd, checking fence lines, reinforcing the shelter structures before the hard cold arrived. They came in for meals colder and tireder than they'd been in September, and the kitchen's importance, scaled accordingly, became the central fact of the ranch's daily life in a way that it hadn't been in the easier weather. Clara adjusted. She always adjusted. She moved the breakfast time earlier by 20 minutes because the men were out before dawn now and needed something hot before they went. She added a mid-morning delivery, just coffee and biscuits, carried out to wherever the main work was happening, which she asked Toby to do because he was fast, and he liked the excuse to move around. She made the suppers heavier, more starch and fat, the kind of food that actually kept a person warm from the inside in a way that thin food couldn't. She noticed that Silas was eating more than he had been. Not dramatically. She was the only one paying close enough attention to notice it, but consistently, cleaning his plate in a way he hadn't done in the first weeks, sometimes taking a second serving of the stew without being offered it. She filed this under the category of things she was glad about, but wasn't going to mention. She also noticed that he had started coming in from the range at a different time. Not earlier exactly. The work dictated his schedule, and she understood that, but more consistently in the sense that she had started to be able to predict within about 20 minutes when he would come through the door, which meant he was running closer to the same routine rather than the unpredictable hours he'd kept before. She was probably reading too much into this. She acknowledged the possibility and continued paying attention anyway. The letter came on a Thursday. It was addressed to her, which was unusual. Most correspondence came addressed to Silas or to Redfern Ranch generally, and it was in an envelope she didn't recognize, with a postmark from a town 2 counties over. She opened it at the kitchen table while the morning's bread was in the oven, and she read it twice, and then she folded it and held it in both hands and sat with what it said. It was from her sister. Margaret, who was 24 now and who Clara hadn't seen in 14 months, since the last difficult time, which was when their mother had died and Clara had gone back for the funeral and stayed 3 weeks helping sort through what little was left and then come back to the life she was building. Margaret wrote in the cramped, practical hand of a woman who didn't write often and so packed everything in when she did. The letter was 4 pages. It covered, in order, the current state of their father's health, which was declining but not urgently, the situation with the house, which had been finally sold, and the proceeds applied to the remaining debts, a cousin's marriage briefly, and then, on the 3rd page, a paragraph that Clara read and reread until she had it almost memorized. I heard from someone who knows someone in Hollow Creek County that people are saying things about you. I don't know what things or how bad, but I want you to know that whatever they're saying is wrong, and if anyone asks me, I will tell them so directly. You were never sent away. You left because you found something worth going to. I know you know that. But I thought someone should say it out loud to you, in case you needed to hear it from someone who was there. Clara sat with that paragraph for a long time. She was not going to cry about it. She didn't cry easily, and she didn't cry at kitchen tables, and she certainly wasn't going to cry into bread dough. But she sat with the paragraph and let it do what it was doing, which was reminding her of a version of herself that existed before all of this. Before the departure and the practical marriage and the proving and the daily work of being considered. A version of herself that her sister had known and still recognized and was willing to testify to. She put the letter in her apron pocket. She went back to the bread. Silas found her quieter than usual at supper. She saw him register it and say nothing, which was the right call. He ate his meal and had his coffee, and when the other men had gone, he stayed at the table with his 2nd cup and didn't try to make conversation, just let the kitchen be what it was, which was quiet and warm and honest. Finally, she pulled the letter out and set it on the table between them. "From my sister," she said. He looked at it without touching it. "Good news or bad?" "Both," she said. "My father's health is going the wrong direction, but she heard about the rumors from someone and she wrote to say they're wrong." She paused. "It's the kind of letter that it's good to get. I just didn't expect it." He was quiet for a moment, then carefully, "How long since you've seen her?" 14 months, she said. "Long time." "Yes." He picked up his coffee cup. He said, looking into it rather than at her, "If you wanted to go see her, at some point, that could be arranged." She looked at him. He was still looking at the coffee cup. "You'd manage without me," she said. It was half a question. "We'd manage badly," he said, "but we'd manage." She almost smiled. She kept it contained. "I'll think about it," she said. She didn't think about it that night because other things needed thinking about first, but she noticed that he'd offered, and she noticed what it cost a man like Silas Redfern to admit that the absence of something would be felt. The thing with Lenora came at the end of the 2nd week of November, and it came not as a new attack but as a continuation of the old one in a different form, which was more sophisticated and therefore more dangerous. Clara heard about it from 2 sources on the same day, which told her it was already in the stage of general circulation. The new version of the story was more specific than the old one. The new version had details. Invented ones, she was certain, but details with the texture of plausibility. It said that Clara had been engaged before Silas to a man of good standing, and that the engagement had been broken by the man's family, not by any failure of money or circumstance, but because of something Clara had done that the family found unacceptable. It was careful not to specify what the something was. It didn't need to. The suggestion was the weapon, not the fact. What made this version more dangerous than the first was that it was 40% true. The engagement had existed, it had been broken. The part about the man's family and the unspecified unacceptable thing was invention, but the skeleton was real, and real bones made invented flesh more credible. Toby told her first in the kitchen, in the way he'd been doing for months now, sliding in the information sideways, not quite looking at her, making clear that he thought she should know, and wasn't sure it was his place to tell her but was going to tell her anyway. He said he'd heard it at the feed store from Burkett, who had heard it from a man who'd been talking to one of the Whitcomb Ranch's hands. She was unsurprised by the source. Ruth Pike came in the afternoon. She sat at the table and said, directly, and without softening it, "It's worse this time. The new version has people who want to believe it doing so more comfortably, because the parts that are real give the parts that aren't somewhere to anchor." I know, Clara said. Orson is angry, Ruth said. He says this is not the way things are done, and he intends to say so publicly, but he wanted me to ask you first what you want him to do. Clara looked at her. What are my options? He can speak directly against it, naming it as malicious and untrue to the best of his knowledge. That carries risk. It elevates the story, makes it more significant by the virtue of him addressing it at all. Ruth paused. Or he can speak about you, not about the rumor, about who you are and what he's observed and what he thinks of it. Let people draw their own conclusions. Clara thought about this. The second, she said. Never the first. Ruth nodded like she'd expected that answer. After Ruth left, Clara sat down at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and wrote a letter to her sister. She wrote it the same way Margaret wrote, not elegantly, but completely, everything in it that needed to be in it. She wrote about the ranch and the men and what the kitchen had become. She wrote about Silas, carefully, in the way you write about a thing you're not entirely ready to name but feel the shape of clearly. She wrote about Lenora and what she was doing and why, and what Clara was choosing to do about it. She wrote, I am not going to disappear. I decided that some time ago, and I have been keeping that decision every day since. She folded the letter and addressed the envelope. She put it with the outgoing mail. She felt better for having written it. She didn't understand entirely why. The letter didn't change anything about the situation. But she understood, from years of managing hard things mostly alone, that sometimes naming a thing to someone who knew you was its own form of traction. She started on supper. Silas came in from the range that evening, and she could tell from the set of his shoulders before he'd said a word that he'd heard the new version. He came into the kitchen and stopped, and she turned and looked at him and said, I know. He said, Clara. Sit down, she said. He sat. She poured the coffee. She put the cup in front of him and then sat down herself, across from him, and she looked at him directly and said what she needed to say because she had been thinking about how to say it for most of the afternoon, and she had decided that she owed him the full version, not the managed version. She told him about Leonard. Not a lot. She didn't have a lot of feeling left about Leonard, which was itself a kind of information. But enough. The engagement. The money failing. What he'd said about practicality. She told him that the bones of the story Lenora was circulating were real bones, even if the flesh was invented. And she told him that she thought he deserved to know that, so he wasn't surprised by it if it got further. When she finished, Silas was looking at his coffee cup. He said, He told you that loyalty and good cooking weren't worth anything. Words to that effect, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, without particular drama, just as a statement of fact, he was wrong. She looked at him. He looked up. About the worth, he said. He was wrong. She held his gaze. Something in the center of her chest was doing something she was choosing not to examine too closely, in the middle of a kitchen on a November night, but she noted it, filed it carefully in the place where she kept things that needed to be understood later. Thank you, she said. She meant it. He nodded, drank his coffee, said nothing else, which was correct. The autumn social's aftermath moved through Hollow Creek the way Hollow Creek moved through most things, slowly, in multiple directions, with the particular inefficiency of a community that doesn't have one opinion and never will. Some people came down clearly on the side that the rumor was malicious and untrue. Some people came down on the side that where there was smoke, there was something, even if they couldn't name the something. Most people occupied the middle, which was not a position of fairness so much as a position of waiting to see which way the stronger current ran before committing. Clara understood this. She had grown up in a community that operated the same way. You couldn't be angry at it. It was just what communities did. The slow, democratic process of collective opinion forming and reforming. What you could do was keep being what you were, keep being it consistently and without variation, and trust that consistency eventually became a kind of evidence. She kept cooking. She kept managing. She kept noting what the men needed before they knew they needed it. She kept track of Toby's biscuit consumption as a rough barometer of his general mental state, because she'd noticed a correlation. When something was bothering him, he ate more and faster, and when things were good, he slowed down and actually tasted things. By mid-November, he was eating more slowly, which she took as a sign that the weight he'd been carrying since she arrived had been lightening incrementally, and she felt something about this that she didn't name but was glad for. The day Amos told her about Silas's mother was a day in mid-November when the first serious snow had come in overnight, and the world outside was white and still and the kind of quiet that snow makes, which is different from other quiet because it has weight. She had made extra everything because she knew the cold changed appetites the way it changed everything else, made people hungry in a bigger, more animal way. Amos had stayed in after breakfast. His knee, she knew without asking, was in one of its bad periods, and was sitting with his coffee at the far end of the table when she was cleaning up. He didn't say anything for a while. She didn't push. Eventually he said, "Silas hasn't eaten like this since before Eleanor died." She kept washing. His mother. 3 years ago March. She ran this kitchen like... He stopped. She was particular about things, how they were done. She had a way of knowing what people needed before they said it. He paused. You remind me of her. Not in how you look, in how you pay attention. Clara turned from the counter. Amos was looking at his coffee cup with the expression of a man who has said more than he intended to say and is not entirely sorry about it. He took it hard, Amos said. The grief kind of settled in and didn't move. He stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping the way he should. The ranch kept running because the ranch had to keep running, but he made a gesture with his hand that was its own sentence. His mother sent for you, basically. That letter she left him. She'd heard about your situation from someone, I don't know who. She wrote it before she died, and she made him promise to send for you. Clara was very still. He didn't want to, Amos said. He fought it for 6 months after she died. Thought it was intrusive. Her reaching into his life like that, even from the end of it. He looked up at her. Then he sent the letter anyway, because she'd asked him to, and because she'd always been right about the things that mattered. Clara stood at the counter with the dish rag in her hands and looked at Amos, who was looking back at her with the steady eyes of a man who has decided this information belongs to her and is giving it over. He doesn't know I'm telling you this, Amos said. I know, she said. He should probably tell you himself, he said. But I've been watching him not tell you for 4 months, and I thought someone should. He picked up his hat. He stood up, slow because of the knee, and he went out without looking at her again, which was a mercy because she needed a minute without being looked at. She put the dish rag down. She pressed her hands flat on the counter. She looked at the window where the snow was still coming down light and steady, accumulating without hurry on the fence posts and the barn roof and the yard where she had stood on her first day, and let 12 men look at her and decided to give them something to actually look at. Eleanor Redfern had seen her from a distance she couldn't measure. From whatever she'd known about Clara's situation, whatever she'd recognized in it, and had decided Clara was what her son needed and her ranch needed, and had used the last of whatever energy she had to make it happen. Clara thought about that. She thought about a woman running a kitchen like this one for 30-odd years, and knowing exactly what it took to keep people intact, and looking at her grieving son and the deteriorating ranch and thinking, that woman. That specific woman. She thought, I wish I had known you. She said it quietly, just to the kitchen, to no one. It needed to be said somewhere. Then she picked up the dish rag and went back to work, because the lunch meal needed starting, and the men would be in from the snow in 2 hours, and they would be cold and they would be hungry, and she knew exactly what each of them needed, and that knowledge was hers to act on. That evening, after supper, after the hands had gone and the kitchen was clean, Silas came in and found her at the table with Margaret's letter open in front of her, rereading it for the 3rd time. He poured his own coffee. He'd started doing that sometime in October, just helping himself rather than waiting for her to pour it, which she'd noticed and found she was glad of. And he sat down across from her. He looked at the letter. Word from your sister? I'm writing back, she said, going through what I want to say. He nodded. He drank his coffee. The snow outside had stopped and the night was very clear and very cold, and through the kitchen window she could see stars in a quantity that the city she'd grown up near had never shown her. She said without looking up from the letter, Amos told me about your mother today. The silence that followed had a specific quality. Not defensive, not startled. More like released, like something that had been held taut had found a reason to go slack. She looked up. He was looking at her with the expression she'd been learning to read over 4 months and still couldn't fully decode, but she could make out the component parts. Something that was not quite guilt, something that was not quite grief, and underneath both of those something else, quieter and less managed, that she did not have a name for yet but recognized by its effect, which was to make her chest feel too small for what was in it. "I should have told you myself," he said. "Yes," she said. "I didn't know how to start." "I know," she said. She did know. She knew exactly how that was, the thing you need to say that you can't find the beginning of. He said, "She was right about you." Clara looked at him. "Whatever she knew or guessed," he said, "she was right." She held his gaze for a long moment. The kitchen was warm around them, and the night was cold outside, and the stars were coming through the window in the specific sharp way they only come when the air is very clean and very cold, and there's nothing between you and them. She said, "What do you want from this, Silas? Not what your mother wanted, not what the ranch needs." She paused. "What do you want?" He looked at her. He had the expression of a man who has been asked a question he has been avoiding for some time and has run out of room to keep avoiding it. He said, "I want—" He stopped. He looked at his hands around the coffee cup. He said, "I want to stop feeling like a man who made a transaction. I want—" He stopped again. He looked up. She waited. He said very quietly, like it was something he was only just now giving himself permission to say out loud, "I want to have done this because I wanted to, not because she asked me to." Clara sat with that. "Can you?" she said. "Want to, I mean, now, when it didn't start that way." "I think it's already happened," he said. "I think it happened a while ago, and I just didn't—" He stopped. "I didn't let myself call it what it was." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside somewhere something moved in the snow. An animal, one of the horses, shifting in the dark. Clara said, "I'm not the same person I was when I got off that train." He looked at her. "Neither am I." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked back down at her sister's letter, and she smoothed the page flat with her palm, and she thought about what Margaret had written. "You left because you found something worth going to." And she thought about the distinction between that and finding it only after you arrived, finding it by accumulation rather than intention, finding it in fixed shelves and biscuits and pockets, and a man who took his hat off indoors, and the way an old foreman had shown up to a social he never attended. She folded the letter. She put it in her apron pocket. She looked at Silas. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He looked at her steadily. His jaw did the thing where it tightened and then released. He said, "I know." It was not a declaration. It was not a resolution. It was not the end of anything or the beginning of anything, not in the dramatic sense, not in the sense that the world drew a line before and after this moment in the kitchen with the stars coming through the window. But something had been said that needed saying, and both of them had said their part of it, and neither of them had looked away. He stayed at the table for another hour. She made a pot of tea because the coffee was done and she wanted tea, and she made enough for 2 cups without asking. She put one in front of him and he looked at it and then drank it without comment, because it was there and she'd made it for him, and that was enough. They sat in the kitchen in the particular silence that had evolved over 4 months, from the silence of 2 strangers into the silence of 2 people who were figured out enough about each other to not need to fill the space between them. It was not everything. She was not going to call it everything. But it was more than a transaction, and they both knew it, and the knowing was the thing that mattered. Winter arrived at Redfern Ranch the way real winter always does in that part of the country, not as a single event but as a commitment. The temperature dropped and stayed dropped. The snow that fell in November didn't leave. It compacted and crusted and was added to by December, layer by layer, until the fence posts were half buried and the path between the house and the barn had to be shoveled clear every morning before anything else could happen. Clara shoveled it herself the first time, before anyone was up, because she'd woken at 4:30 and heard the wind and looked out the window and assessed the situation and decided the path needed doing. She was halfway through when Toby appeared, coat half buttoned, with the second shovel from the barn, and took over without comment. She let him. She went in and started the stove. This was how the ranch worked now, not because she'd designed it that way or managed it into that shape, but because it had arrived there through the accumulation of small daily decisions made by people who had started paying attention to each other. The path got shoveled because Toby noticed it needed doing. The coffee was ready because Clara started it before anyone needed it. The horses were checked before the temperature warning Amos had been predicting for 2 days, because Silas trusted Amos's knee as a weather instrument and acted on it without being told twice. Things worked because people had stopped waiting to be asked. She noticed this. She didn't say anything about it. Saying something would have made it self-conscious, and self-conscious things had a way of becoming awkward and then ceasing to function. She just let it run. The thing with Lenore resolved itself in December, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the specific social arithmetic of a small community finally running out of patience with manipulation. Clara was not entirely sure how it happened. She heard pieces of it from Ruth Pike and a different piece from Miriam Callahan at the general store and a third piece from Toby, who had an instinct for knowing what was happening in Hollow Creek that probably would have served him well in a different career. What she understood, assembled from the pieces, was this. Judge Pike had done what Ruth said he would do, which was speak about Clara rather than about the rumor, in enough context and with enough consistency that people had started to understand the implicit message. And then something happened that Clara hadn't anticipated and couldn't have planned. Several of the ranch hands had gone into town on a Saturday. The regular end-of-week trip for supplies and the particular socializing that men do when they've been working hard in cold weather and need to be around other people for a few hours. Burkett was there, and Denny, and two of the quieter men whose names she still sometimes mixed up, Hayes and Caldwell. They were at the feed store when someone, she never found out exactly who, and didn't try too hard to find out, made a comment about the Redfern situation, about Clara specifically, about the rumor. Burkett, who expressed himself through action rather than words, and who had been working through his own accounting of the past several months, apparently expressed himself through action on this occasion as well. Not violently, she was clear on this point when Toby told her, but with a directness that had left the person making the comment with no uncertainty about where the Redfern Ranch hands stood on the subject. Then Denny had said his piece. Then Hayes. Then Caldwell, who she was almost certain had never voluntarily entered a social confrontation in his life, added something brief that was apparently effective. 4 men who 3 months ago had been skeptical of her existence had walked into a public space and made their position clear, without being asked, without being organized, without any coordination that she was aware of. They had just decided, individually, and apparently simultaneously, that they were done staying quiet about it. She found out about this on a Monday morning when Toby told her, leaning against the kitchen doorframe in the way he'd been leaning there for months, eating a biscuit, and she kept her face neutral through the telling, and then she turned back to the stove. "You all right?" Toby said. "I'm fine," she said. She heard him nod. She heard him finish the biscuit. She heard him push off the doorframe to go back to work. And she said without turning around, "Toby." "Yeah?" "Tell Burkett the next batch of biscuits is his." A pause. She could feel him grinning without seeing it. "I'll tell him," he said, and he was gone. She stood at the stove and pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum for a moment. Not dramatically, just applying a little pressure to the thing happening in her chest, the thing that still didn't have a name after all these months, but that she was starting to think might not need one. Some things didn't need names. Some things were just the feeling of not being alone in a room, even when you were standing in it by yourself. She put more flour in the bowl. Lenora's influence in Hollow Creek didn't collapse overnight. That was not how it worked, and Clara hadn't expected it to. What happened was more gradual and more complete. The community quietly revised its understanding of events, the way communities do when they've been manipulated long enough to start feeling foolish about it. The revision didn't announce itself. It just showed up in small behavioral shifts. People who had been cool toward Clara becoming ordinary again. Conversations in the general store returning to the comfortable normalness of before. The specific social chill that had accumulated around Redfern Ranch in November, dissipating back into the ordinary temperature of a community that had moved on to other concerns. Vivian Whitcomb came to see Clara in December. Alone, without her mother, which told Clara everything about what the visit was before Vivian said a word. She came on a Tuesday afternoon when the ranch was quiet and sat at the kitchen table and accepted the tea Clara offered and held the cup in both hands, the way people do when they need something warm to hold. She said, "I want you to know I didn't have anything to do with what was said about you." "I know," Clara said. "I want you to know I told my mother that what she was doing was wrong." Clara looked at her. "How did that go?" Vivian's mouth did something that was almost a smile. "About how you'd expect." Clara sat down across from her. "Why are you here, Vivian?" The younger woman was quiet for a moment. She looked out the window at the snow. "I'm leaving Hollow Creek," she said. "I have an aunt in Portland. She's been asking me to come for 2 years and I've been—" She stopped. "My mother had plans for this place. For me, I mean. And I kept telling myself she was probably right about what I needed, because she was usually right about other things." She paused. "She wasn't right about you." "She wasn't right about several things," Clara said, not unkindly. Vivian looked at her. "No, she wasn't." She drank her tea. "I just wanted to say that. Before I left, it felt wrong to go without saying it." Clara looked at this 23-year-old woman who had spent the past several months being aimed at a life she hadn't chosen and who had finally found her way to a decision that was hers. And she thought about all the ways that a person could be used as a piece in someone else's arrangement without consenting to be one. And she thought about what it cost to finally stop. "Portland's a good city," Clara said. Vivian looked at her with something in her eyes that was surprised and grateful in the specific way of someone who expected a harder conversation and got a door opened instead. "You've been?" "No," Clara said. "But I've heard." Vivian left an hour later. Clara watched the wagon go from the kitchen window and thought, "I hope Portland is what she needs." She meant it, without qualification, without any of the complicated feelings she might have expected to have toward a woman who had been positioned as her replacement. Vivian hadn't positioned herself. She'd just been young and in the wrong situation, and now she was leaving it, which was the correct decision and possibly a brave one. January settled in and made the November cold seem like a trial run. The temperature dropped to things Clara didn't have good vocabulary for, having grown up somewhere with milder winters. She learned new things about cold. She learned that it had texture. The dry, brittle cold of a clear day was different from the wet, penetrating cold of a cloudy one. And both were different from the vicious, still cold of a night that had decided to see how far down it could go. She learned that cooking for cold people required a different calculation than cooking for tired people, that warmth needed to arrive in the body before it could arrive in the spirit, and that this was accomplished with fat and starch and heat and the smell of something that told the animal brain that the outside was being held at bay. She made soup that month. A lot of it. The kind that started in the morning and ran until supper, getting better as it went. The kind her mother had called thinking soup because it required nothing from you except patience and the occasional adjustment. Silas ate it every night that month without complaint, which was his version of enthusiasm. The conversation they'd had in November, the one about wanting rather than transacting, about it having already happened even if the naming had been slow, that conversation didn't change things dramatically, and she hadn't expected it to. What it changed was the quality of the space between them, the texture of the daily life they were living alongside each other. He was not suddenly demonstrative. I was not suddenly talkative. He was still Silas, which meant he expressed himself through action and through the particular quality of his attention, and she had gotten good enough at reading both that the language no longer needed translation. He asked her in January about her mother's recipes. Not casually. It was a deliberate question, asked on a quiet evening when they were alone in the kitchen, and he asked it carefully, the way he asked things he'd been thinking about for a while. What dishes, what the proportions were, whether she'd written them all down. She looked at him. "Why?" He said, "Because they should be written down, the way my mother's were." He paused. "Somewhere permanent." She understood what he meant. He meant the recipe box. He meant the thing that had been in the pantry since she arrived, that she had opened and read and put back with the care you give something that belongs to someone important. He was saying her mother's recipes belonged in it too. She didn't know what to do with that for a moment. She managed it by going to the pantry and getting the box and sitting down at the table and opening it, and he sat down across from her, and she started going through the recipes that were already there and telling him what they were, because it seemed like the right place to start. They sat there for 2 hours. She told him about the recipes in the box, and then she told him about the one she carried in her head. Her mother's soup, the way she adjusted the honey bread by season, the apple pie that had existed before either of them could remember. He listened the way he listened to things that mattered to him, which was with complete attention and very few words. Occasionally he asked a clarifying question. Occasionally he said something about his mother's cooking, small things, specific things. The way you talk about someone when the grief has settled enough to let you access the good parts without the access being unbearable. They were not talking about recipes. They both knew this. But sometimes the indirect approach is the only approach to a thing that is too large and too new to be addressed head-on, and recipes were a language they both had, and the other language was still being assembled. February was when Amos stopped hiding his knee. He didn't announce this change. He just stopped performing normalcy about it. Stopped taking routes around the yard that were longer but didn't require certain steps. Stopped waiting until no one was looking to shift his weight. Stopped declining help with things that were made harder by a joint that had given out its best years to ranch work. He started using the stick that had been hanging in the barn for as long as anyone could remember, and that everyone had pretended not to notice. Clara said nothing about it. She just moved his chair to the position at the table that required the least maneuvering, and she started handing him his coffee rather than leaving it on the counter for him to collect. And she made sure the path to the outhouse was always the first path cleared in the morning, before anything else. He noticed. He didn't say anything. One morning in February, he came into the kitchen and found her adjusting the second pantry shelf. Not the one he'd fixed months ago, but the one above it that had developed a tilt. And he stood in the doorway and watched her and said, "Eleanor would have done that herself too." She climbed down from the step stool. "I know," she said. He looked at her. He said, not like it was a compliment, and not like it was anything other than a statement of fact. "You belong here." Then he went and got his coffee. She stood by the pantry for a moment. Then she put the step stool away and got back to work. Spring came the way spring comes after a hard winter, which is not gracefully. It came in pieces, the snow receding and returning and receding again, the ground alternating between frozen and muddy in a way that was arguably worse than either state alone. The men worked through it with the particular determination of people who have been waiting for the world to cooperate and have decided to stop waiting. The ranch was different from what it had been the previous spring, when Clara had not yet existed in its life. This was visible in small ways and large ones. The pantry was organized and stocked with intention. The equipment in the barn was maintained on a schedule rather than when it broke. The men's bunkhouse had curtains. This had happened in February when Clara found extra fabric, and Toby had accepted the gift with less protest than she'd expected and had apparently hung them himself on a Saturday afternoon, an act which she filed among the most quietly touching things she had witnessed on this ranch. The work was better because the people doing it were better rested and better fed, and had started, somewhere in the long interior months, to feel that the work they did was worth something beyond the paycheck. She hadn't created this. She wanted to be clear-eyed about that. She hadn't manufactured anything. She had just shown up consistently and paid attention and cooked the food and let people feel that their presence at a table mattered, which was a thing her mother had done and which she had learned without knowing she was learning it. Silas put her name on the ranch account in March. He told her as a matter of practical information, standing in the kitchen doorway with a paper from the bank, handing it to her and saying, "You should have access. It doesn't make sense that you don't." She looked at the paper and then at him and said, "All right." He went back outside. She put the paper in the kitchen drawer where she kept the supply lists, which was where she kept the things that were hers to manage, and went back to what she'd been doing. She did not make it into a ceremony. He hadn't presented it as one, and she understood that in this language, the language that was theirs, the ordinary was how the significant got expressed. In April, a letter came from her sister. Margaret was coming to visit, just for 2 weeks. She was practical about time the way Clara was. They were the same in that. But she was coming, and she would arrive on the second Thursday of the month. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table and then went and told Silas and watched his face do the small reorganization it did when he was thinking through logistics. He said, "Which room?" "The one across from the office," she said. "The east light is better." He nodded. "I'll have Toby air it out." She went back to the kitchen and stood there for a moment with the letter in her hand and felt something she didn't often allow herself, which was uncomplicated happiness. Not the managed satisfaction of a thing accomplished or the careful gratitude of a position maintained. Just the simple warmth of something good that was coming and that she had done nothing to earn except survive long enough to get to. Margaret arrived on the second Thursday of April in a state of organized travel that told Clara her sister had planned the trip with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. She was taller than Clara remembered, or maybe Clara had been thinking of the younger version of her. She stepped off the wagon with her bag and looked at the ranch in the way of someone who has been forming a mental picture for months and is now comparing it to reality. She looked at Clara. "It's real," she said. "What did you think it was?" Clara said. "I wasn't sure," Margaret said. She put her arm around Clara briefly, which was the most demonstrative either of them was with the other, and then she pulled back and looked around. "Where's your husband?" Silas came out of the barn at that moment, as if the question had summoned him, and Clara watched her sister look at him with the particular assessment that sisters make, the one that is not about appearance or status, but about whether the person in question is going to be all right for the person they love. She watched Margaret's expression move through several iterations in about 4 seconds and arrive at something neutral, but not disappointed. Silas said, "Mrs." and stopped because he didn't know Margaret's married name, and she wasn't married. "Margaret Bellamy," Margaret said. "Just Margaret." "Silas Redfern," he said. "You'll want to see the room." "I'll want coffee first," she said. "It was a long ride." He looked at her. He said, "Kitchen's this way." Clara followed them inside and stood at the stove making coffee and listened to her sister and her husband exchange the careful preliminary conversation of two people who know they matter to the same person and are trying to calibrate each other. And she thought, "This is my kitchen. These are my people. I brought them here. I built the room that holds them." Not by herself. She was honest about that. Silas had made the arrangement. Eleanor Redfern had sent for her. The men had eaten the food and come back to the table. Judge Pike had used his authority in her defense. Amos had shown up to a social he never attended. Toby had hung curtains in the bunkhouse on a Saturday afternoon. She had not done it alone, but she had been the thing around which the rest of it organized itself, the fixed point that the rest of it oriented to, and she had been that thing consistently, every day, without guarantee that it would matter. It had mattered. Margaret stayed 2 weeks and 1 day, the extra day granted by a late connection that Clara suspected her sister had engineered deliberately. She helped in the kitchen without being asked, which Clara appreciated, and she walked the property with Silas one afternoon and came back with an expression that had moved from cautious to settled, which was Margaret's version of approval. She told Clara on her last evening that Silas was not what she'd imagined. Clara asked what she'd imagined. Margaret said, "Someone easier." Clara said, "Easy wasn't what I needed." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "No, I don't think it was." On the morning Margaret left, she stood in the kitchen with her bag and looked at the room the way Ruth Pike had looked at it the night of the county dinner, with something personal in it, something that recognized not just the space but what the space represented. "Mama would have understood this place," she said. Clara poured her coffee into a travel cup, the tin one she used for the supply runs. She handed it to her. "I know," she said. Margaret hugged her once properly, the kind that means something. Then she went out to the wagon, where Silas was waiting to drive her to the station, and Clara stood in the kitchen doorway and watched them go. The yard was quiet after the wagon turned out of sight. The spring morning was cool and clear and smelled like thawed earth, and the particular aliveness that comes after a hard winter, when everything that survived starts taking stock. Toby appeared from the direction of the barn. He glanced at the empty road and then at Clara. He said, "She coming back?" "Probably next year," Clara said. He nodded. "She's all right," he said, which from Toby was a considerable endorsement. "She is," Clara agreed. He went back to the barn. Clara went back inside. She stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the recipe box on the second shelf, where it had lived since the day she'd pulled out Eleanor Redfern's recipes and made a pie with dried apple from the bottom of a supply list that Silas had not crossed out enough. Her mother's recipes were in there now, too. The ones she'd told him about in January, the ones she'd written onto cards in her own handwriting while he sat across from her asking careful questions. Her cards and Eleanor's cards, and a few of the men's mother's recipes that had found their way into the box over the winter, Toby's mother's cornbread among them, which she had coaxed from him over 3 separate conversations because he kept stopping and restarting when he tried to remember it, the memory of the food and the memory of the woman being too tangled to separate cleanly. The box was fuller now. It held more than it had. That was the plain fact of it. She put a pot on the stove for the lunch soup. She measured the flour for the afternoon's bread. She did these things with the same hands she had used to step off a train 14 months ago, in a gray traveling dress with $31 in her boot, the same hands that had been judged as soft and found insufficient and told, in various ways by various people, that they could not hold enough to matter. They had held enough. They had held this. The daily ordinary accumulation of enough. Enough food, enough attention, enough patience, enough willingness to stay when staying was difficult, and to be seen when being seen was dangerous. This was not a triumphant story, not in the way that stories are supposed to be triumphant, with music and recognition, and someone finally saying the thing everyone should have said at the start. The triumph here was quieter and more durable, the kind that shows up in a foreman who stops hiding his bad knee, in curtains hung in a bunkhouse on a Saturday, in a man who takes his hat off inside and stays at the table and says, "I want to have done this because I wanted to." That was the thing Leonard had gotten wrong. And Lenora, and the 12 men who had stood in the doorway on the first morning and made their calculations. They had been measuring the wrong things. They had been looking at soft hands and a gray dress, and a woman who arrived asking for only a roof and a purpose, and they had seen insufficiency. They had not seen what the hands could do. They had not seen that a purpose, given room, becomes a life. She heard Silas in the yard, the particular sound of his boots on the frozen ground that she would have recognized out of 100 sets of footsteps now. She heard him stop at the back door. She heard him come in. She didn't turn around. She was working. He poured himself coffee. He stood at the counter a few feet away and drank it, and didn't say anything, and neither did she. And the kitchen held them the way it had been holding people for longer than either of them had been alive, with warmth and without conditions, with the particular generosity of a room that has been used for its true purpose long enough that the purpose has soaked into the walls. After a while he said, "Margaret's train was on time." "Good," she said. He drank his coffee. She stirred the soup. Outside, the spring was continuing its slow, reliable work of returning things to life. The grass at the edges of the fence post going green, the horses in the field moving differently than they had all winter, looser, the way living things move when the world has stopped making everything harder than it needs to be. The bread would be ready in 2 hours. The soup would be ready by noon. 12 men would come in from the field cold and hungry, and they would sit down at the long table and they would eat, and the eating would be good, and the goodness of it would carry them through the afternoon the way it had been carrying them all winter. This was what she had made. Not from nothing. That was the dishonest version, the version that required a kind of isolation she had never had and never wanted. From what was here. From the specific materials of this specific life. A warped stove and a recipe box, and a foreman with a bad knee, and a 17-year-old who ate biscuits faster when he was afraid and slower when he was all right. From a man who had married her because his mother asked him to, and had arrived, through the long interior winter of his own nature, at something he chose. She kept stirring. The ranch was not perfect. It was never going to be perfect. The fence needed work on the east side. Burkett still said the wrong thing at the wrong moment, at least twice a week. Toby had a long way to go, and so did the rest of them, all of them, herself included. She still burned things occasionally, still miscalculated quantities, still had mornings when the weight of the accumulated months sat heavier than she wanted to carry. She carried it anyway. That was the whole thing, in the end. That was what her mother had known, and what Eleanor Redfern had known from a distance, and what Clara had been learning her entire life without a name for the learning. You showed up. You paid attention. You did the work in front of you without waiting for the work to become worthy of you. And if you were very patient and very honest and very willing to be seen as what you were, rather than what you could perform, the life around you eventually came to understand its own shape. She turned from the stove. Silas was looking at her. He'd been watching her work, which he did sometimes, without self-consciousness, the way a person looks at something that belongs in the place where it is. She met his eyes. He said simply, with nothing extra in it, the way he said the things that mattered most. "It's a good kitchen." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Yes." She turned back to the stove. The soup was almost ready, the bread was rising. The ranch outside was waking into spring, and Clara Bellamy Redfern stood at the stove in a kitchen that had needed her before she knew it existed, and she stirred the pot, and she stayed.